Depuis qu'à Paris, on a pris la Bastille. Je sais plus ce que j'ai fait de mon téléphone. C'est embêtant. Ah, là. Dans chaque faubourg, à chaque carrefour, il y a des gars et il y a des filles qui s'envolent sur les pavés. Des jours font des tours et des tours à Paris. Hello. Alors je regarde si je peux me mettre en direct sur Twitter en même temps. Non, ça risque d'être compliqué. Parce que je peux pas caler mon téléphone. C'est pas grave. N'hésitez pas à prévenir les gens sur Twitter. Si je mets là, non, ça marche pas. Depuis Paris, on a pris la Bastille. Dans chaque faubourg, à chaque carrefour. Non, allez, on va commencer. Donc, Levinson, Art and History. Defining art historically. The question of what makes something art is probably the most venerable in aesthetics. What is the artness of an artwork? Wherein does it reside? We would certainly like to know. We would certainly be interested to learn what ties together Dickens' Oliver Twist, Tally's Spent in Alien, Flavin's Pink and Gold, Balanchine's variations for a door and a sigh. That's not Balanchine's, that Henry, I don't remember. Henry something, Variation pour une portée en soupir, it's not Balanchine's. Variation Pierre-Henri, it's not Balanchine's. N'importe quoi, il s'est trompé. Hein. Il s'est trompé. Peut-être que c'est un ballet, je ne sais pas. Mais à la base, c'est de Pierre-Henri et c'est une œuvre musicale. Wilson and Glass's Einstein on the Beach. Ah, c'est dans Balanchine. The Parthenon, and countless other unknown and unsung objects under the common banner of art. After rejecting the many proposals made by philosophers from Plato to the present on grounds of narrowness, tendentiousness, inflexibility, faith, the institutional theory of art, adumbrated by Arthur sort of answer. The institutional theory of art, adumbrated by Arthur Danto, and propounded explicitly by George Dickey. In short, the theory is that artworks are artworks because they occupy a certain place, which they must be given in a certain institution, that of art. Dickey's definition of art runs as follows. A work of art in the classificatory sense is 1. An artifact, 2. A set of the aspects of which has had conferred upon it the status of candidate for appreciation by some person or persons acting on behalf of a certain social institution, the art world. In Art and the Aesthetic, Cornell University Press. In this essay, I would like to begin to develop an alternative to the institutional theory of art, albeit one that is clearly inspired by it. What I will retain from that theory is the crucial idea that artwork could, is not an intrinsic exhibited property of a thing, but rather a matter of being related in the right way to human activity and thought. However, I propose to construe this relation solely in terms of the intention of an independent individual or individuals, as opposed to an overt act, that of conferring the status of a candidate for appreciation, performed in an institutional setting constituted by many individuals, where the intention makes reference either transparently or opaquely to the history of art, what art has been, as opposed to that murky and somewhat exclusive institution, the art world. The core of my proposal will be an account of it is to regard as a work of art, an account that gives this an essential historicity. The suggestions that regarding as a work of art may be a primary notion, and that the nature of art must be located in its historical development, can be found in Richard Wollheim's Art and Subjects, New York Harper and Row, section 40 and 60-61 respectively. It is those remarks that first prompted me to work out the view I am trying to present. I might add here that I use regard in this essay as a broad term covering whatever is done in relations to an object so as to experience or interact with it. It is this which will do the work in my theory which the notion of art world is supposed to do in the institutional theory. That art is necessarily backward looking, though in some cases not consciously so, is a fact that the definition of art must recognize. To ignore it is to miss the only satisfying explanation of the unity of art across time and of its inherently continuous evolution, the manner in which art of a given moment must involve, as opposed to merely follow, that which has preceded it. Before sketching my view in some detail, I want to remark on two major difficulties with institutional theory. I pass over the often made charges that the theory is uninformative and that the key notions of art world and control of status are vague and artificial. For useful criticism of the institutional theory, see R. Stephanie, Art as a Social Institution, Dickey's New Definitions, Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, R. Stephanie, Artworks, Art Theory, and the Art World. Chico and the Possibility of Art, Remarks on a Proposal by Dickey, Philosophical Review. A Silvers, The Art World Discarded, Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Walton Review, Kendall Walton, Dickey, Art and the Aesthetic, Philosophical Review. But Bertsley, Is Art Essentially Institutional? In Culture and Art, Agathe Morgensen, Humanities Press. I share many of the misgivings expressed by these authors. The first problem is the implication that art making must involve a certain cultural performance, a ceremony or quasi-ceremony, a kind of hand waving that draws into the fold. One must do something outwardly, and one must do it in relation to a certain social institution. On the contrary, I would urge that there can be private, isolated art that is constituted as art in the mind of the artist, and on no one's behalf but his or her own, and that of potential experiencers of it. I assume that just that is not enough to make the art world, or else the notion becomes trivial and odious. Although in my scheme an art maker will typically have art and an existing society of art consumers in mind when producing an art object, this is not necessary. In no case must one invoke or accord with the shadowy infrastructure of the art world to make what one makes into art. Consider the farmer's wife at a Nebraska country fair who sets an assemblage of eggshells and white glue down on the corner of a table for folks to look at. Isn't it possible that she has created art? Yet she and the art world exist in perfect mutual oblivion. Consider a solitary Indian along the Amazon who steals off from his non-artistic tribe to arrange colored stones in a clearing, not outwardly investing them with special position in the world. Might not this also be art, and note before any future curator decides that it is? The institutional theory comes close to conflating art and self-conscious art, art and socially situated art, art and declared art. The second and main problem I find with institutional theory is that the art world must do all the work in specifying the way in which an object has to be presented or treated in order for it to be a work of art, whereas the notion of appreciation, the point of the enterprise, is not specified at all or only in the most general terms, which even then may be subject to counterexamples, as well as being unilluminating in any case. Cf. Cohen, Possibility of Art. Dickey's extremely general suggestion for the meaning of appreciation is, in experiencing the qualities of a thing, one finds them worthy or valuable. That is to say, we are not told enough about what the art maker must envisage, must be done with his or her object by potential spectators. It seems, though, that some kind of specification of this must be essayed if making art is to be distinguished from making non-art. I believe the key to an adequate and revealing definition of art is to specify what the art object must be intended for, what sort of regard the spectator must be asked to extend to the object, rather than designate an institution on behalf of which some such request can be made. The trick, of course, is to do so without describing an intended way of regard given by fixed characteristics, with full attention contemplatively giving special notice to appearance, with emotional openness. It has been sufficiently shown that that sort of definition is doomed to failure, given the impossibility of locating a single unitary aesthetic attitude or regard common to all the ways we approach and have approached works of art, and given the ways unthought of in which we will undoubtedly be approaching some works in the future. The definition I will offer does not hamstring the kinds of regard that may eventually be given to artworks, yet gives the art-making intention the content it sorely needs. 3. The above-mentioned content is to be found in the actual historical development of art. My idea is roughly this: a work of art is a thing intended for regard as a work of art, regard in any of the ways works of art existing prior to it have been correctly regarded. In the absence of any identifiable aesthetic attitude, how else can regard as a work of art be understood? Obviously, in adopting this proposal, we are not analyzing art completely in non-art terms. Rather, what we are doing is explicating what it is for an object to be art at a given time with reference to the body of past art taken as unproblematic. But what it is for a thing to be art at any time can eventually be exhibited in this manner by starting with the present and working backward. New art is art because of this relation to past art. Art of the recent past is art because of this relation to art of the non so recent past. Art of the not so recent past is art because of this relation to art of the distant past. Until one arrives presumably at the or arts of our tradition, those to which the mantle of art can be initially attached, but but which are art not in virtue of any relation to preceding objects. I will return to the arts in section 7. Before stating a more careful definition, let me further attempt to explain the motives for its introduction. The concept of artwork is unlike that of other sorts of things that surround us, cars, chairs, persons. Artwork seems to lack antecedently defined limits in terms of intrinsic features, even flexible ones, as opposed to car, chair, person. There is no question of determining in all cases that something is art by weighing it against some archetype or other. The only clue one has is the particular, concrete, and multifarious population that art has acquired at any point, that is, assuming, as I do, the nebulousness and or inessentiality of that institution, the art world. It appears almost obvious, then, that for a prospective object to count as art must be for it to be related in some way to those objects that have already been decided or determined. For a thing to be art, it must be linked by its creator to the repository of art existing the time, as opposed to being aligned by him with some abstracted template of required characteristics. What I am saying is that currently the concept of art has no content beyond what art has been. It is this content that must figure in a successful definition. Let me focus on the central case of art-aware art makers. In such cases, making an artwork is a conscious act involving a conception of art. But what conception of art can all such art makers, existing at different times and places, have in common? It seems the only possibility is a conception of art tantamount to all or anything that has been art until now, a concrete conception not equivalent to any abstract principle or generalization drawn from a survey of art's past. Art-aware art makers are thus those who connect their creations to such a conception, and their activities involve no reference whatsoever to the body of artworks preceding them. Then I think we fail to understand in what sense they are consciously or knowingly producing art. Given the abandonment of special aesthetic attitudes and/or artistic purposes, some connection of some sort between current artworks and earlier ones must logically be demanded of the putative art maker. It looks as if there are three likely ways in which the connection might be established. One, by making something that will be externally similar to previous artworks. Two, by making something that is intended to afford the same kind of pleasure or experience that previous artworks have afforded. Three, by making something that is intended for regard or treatment as previous artworks have been regarded or treated. The first suggestion, while the simplest, clearly will not do. It is useless unless respects of similarity are indicated, since just about anything would be externally similar to some past artwork in some respect. But aside from that, artworks are just not to any great extent bound together by external similarity. For example, certain welded iron sculptures resemble portions of junkyards more closely than they do the sculptures that were their predecessors. External similarity to artworks is neither necessary nor sufficient for being an artwork. The second suggestion is more promising, but it fails too. There are two reasons for this. One, the pleasures experiences derived from art are not necessarily unique to art. Two, it is the manner in which artworks afford their pleasures experiences, the ways in which one approaches or engages them so that they give those pleasures experiences, which characterize them as art. To illustrate these points, imagine a drug that when ingested would provide a pleasure experience akin to what one can have by listening intently to Beethoven's Quartet in C-sharp minor, opus 131. Such a drug would not thereby be an artwork, although it would be a handy thing to have around. Furthermore, to focus on the pleasures derived from artworks is to emphasize the passive and resultant in the situation, as opposed to the active and causative, that is to say, the way of taking the object. It is more reasonable to hold that an artist directing an object toward potential spectators is concerned intentionally with what is to be done with the object, as opposed to what might be got out of it, since spectators can only directly adjust themselves or behave with respect to the former. So I think we are left with the third suggestion as the only one around with which to build an account of what is to be art, what it is to be art. 4. A definition that preserves my basic idea but adds certain qualifications is the following. 1. X is an artwork if not if X is an object that a person or persons, having the appropriate proprietary right over X, non-passingly intends for regard as a work of art, that is to say, regard in any way or ways in which prior artworks are or were correctly or standardly regarded. Several comments on this initial definition are in order. First, there is the phrase intends for. This is to be understood as short for makes, appropriates, or conceives for the purpose of, so as to comprehend fashioned, found, and conceptual art. Second, there is the notion that the intent must be fairly stable, non-passing, as opposed to merely transient. In other words, it is not enough to turn an object into art that one momentarily considers it for regard as a work of art. Third, I have construed regard as a work of art as equivalent to ways of regarding past art only in so far as they are or were correct or standard ways. If one omits this qualification, or appeals instead to common ways of regard, or even rewarding ways of regard, the definition will go awry. The following case illustrates this point. Italian Renaissance portraits are presumably artworks. Suppose they come to be regarded in a new and unprecedented way, viz., they begin to be used as thermal insulation and are found to be quite suitable for this. And suppose through an amazing decline in taste or an unparalleled need for insulation, this manner of regard becomes the rule. If we omit correctly from our definition, or replace it by commonly or rewardingly, then given the case as described, it follows from our definition that anything subsequently intended by its maker for use as insulation. A sheet of fiberglass would be an artwork. Why? Because Renaissance portraits are past artworks that are commonly regarded, and are rewardingly regarded as insulation. This must be wrong. It can be possible to turn all tomorrow's fiberglass projection into art simply through general misuse today of a certain class of portraits. To avoid this unwanted consequence, we must appeal to some notion of correct regarding for artworks. The notion of correct regard for an artwork is a difficult one to make out, but surely relevant to it are the following considerations. 1. How the artist intended this work to be regarded. 2. What manner of regarding the work is most rewarding. 3. The kinds of regard similar objects have enjoyed. 4. What way of regarding the work is optimum for realizing the ends, certain pleasures, moods, awarenesses, which the artist envisaged in connection with appreciation. 5. What way of regarding the work makes for the most satisfying or coherent picture of its place in the development of art. For an illuminating discussion of some of these factors, see Orton Categories of Art, Philosophical Reviews. Nothing in the present paper depends on the exact analysis of correct regard, however. To understand my account of art, one only has to grant that there are correct ways of regarding past artworks, whatever that might amount to. Using Renaissance portraits as insulation is manifestly not a correct way of regarding them, no matter how widespread or satisfactory such a use might be. And so on our definition, nothing can become art through intentional reference to such a prior way of regarding artworks. Fourth, the definition includes a proprietary right condition. What this amounts to is basically ownership. You cannot artify what you do not own and thus have no right to dispose of. Your intentions will not avail in such a case because another person's intention, that of the owner, has priority over yours. Of course, if owners are not opposed to your intention, they can grant you permission to make their possessions into artworks. One standardly attains the right in question by creating an object, but notice that this will not always suffice. For example, if the object is created under contract during working hours while in the employ of a metal tubing company. On the other hand, neither it is necessary to create something in order to have the right to artify it, as witnessed by found art. It might be thought that the proprietary right condition would rule out varieties of conceptual art, but this is not so. One must just avoid the mistake of taking the art object in such cases to be simply and solely what the artist has described or pointed to. Marilyn Monroe, the Empire State Building, a slice of the life of a family in Queens, things that the artist clearly has no proprietary right over, rather than the directed complex of the description and the object. Given the proprietary right condition, it is somewhat problematic whether curators, promoters, exhibitors can turn non-art objects of the past into art objects of the present as blithely as is usually allowed. Imagine an art museum having mounted for regard as a work of art a strange ornate receptacle whose original purpose is unknown. The object comes from an ancient Mexican culture thought to have died out. However, a well-documented descendant of the tribe, armed with full knowledge of its customs and practices, appears and successfully demands the removal of the receptacle from public view. It is apparently a sacred ritual object, used for nocturnal royal baptisms, and not in any sense for appreciation. I maintain that the object in question does not just revert to being non-art, it never was art at all, because our present art establishment unknowingly lacked the right to make it such. This sort of case may be more prevalent than is generally imagined. Sorry, 2 seconds. It will be useful to distinguish three kinds of intention which can realize the condition expressed in the definition, intending for regard as a work of art. The first would be the specific art-conscious intention, intending for regard in the specific way or ways some particular past artworks or class of artworks have been correctly regarded. An example of this would be intending for regard in the way wire sculptures are to be regarded. The second is the non-specific art-conscious intention, intending for regard in whatever ways any past artworks have been correctly regarded, having no particular ones in mind. The third is the art unconscious intention, intending for regard in some specific way, not characterized in terms of intrinsic features, where is in fact a way in which some past artworks have been correctly regarded, though this fact is not known to the intender. An example of this might be intending for listening to with attention to timbre. The first and second kinds realize intending for regard as a work of art on a referentially opaque interpretation of that notion, whereas the third kind satisfies a transparent interpretation of it. Given the notion as readable in both modes, my definition thus allows, via the art unconscious intention, for art makers ignorant of all artworks, all art activities, and all institutions of art. Such persons can be seen to make art if they intend their objects for regard in ways that happen to be, unbeknown to them, in the repertory of aesthetic regards established at that time. In such a case, there is the requisite link to the prior history of art, but it is one such art makers are unaware of, though they have in fact forged it. So cases of naive activity can be cases of art making if they accord with the development of art at that point in the manner sketched. And I would insist that the theory must account for these cases. From where we stand, such person, the Amazon Indian mentioned before, are clearly making art, and it is not our recognition that makes it so. 5. The definition presented in the preceding section conveys in a fairly perspicuous fashion what I believe it now means for something to be an artwork. However, at the expense of some perspicuity, but in the name of greater precision and flexibility, I offer a second definition that makes explicit the time dependence of the status of artwork, clarifies the interpretation of prior artworks, and indicates more exactly what sort of definition of art I am giving. X is an artwork at T. Df, X is an object of which it is true at T that some person or persons having the appropriate proprietary right over X non-passingly intends or intended X for regard as a work of art, that is to say, regard in any way or ways in which artworks existing prior to T are or were correctly or standardly regarded. An object can be an artwork at one time and not another. This definition recognizes that an object may not be an artwork from the moment of its physical creation, but may only become an artwork at some later date. It also allows for an object that becomes an artwork even subsequent to its creator's intending it for a certain regard, and even subsequent to the death of its creator. There are three times of importance that should be distinguished if we are to get clear on this issue. One is the time of physical creation of the object, T. A second is the time of intentioned object creation, T, that is to say, the time at which the brute object is structured or transformed by a certain intention concerning it. Every artwork is, strictly speaking, an intentioned object. A third is the time of art becoming T. In the typical or normal case of art production, T is T. Well, in the case of found art, T is earlier than T, another T, and in the case of the naive creator ahead of his time, discussed below, T equals T, and T is later than T. Bref. The third sort of case is relatively common. Any piece of found art serves as an example. The snow shovel involved in Duchamp's snow shovel, or the bottle rack in this bottle rack, became works of art at a certain time owing to Duchamp's appropriating them with a certain intention, whereas they existed but were not works of art before the time. The same goes for driftwood mounted and displayed in someone's living room, or potsherds and door handles touched by curatorial intent in a museum of primitive art. Another kind of example would be a canvas that is undertaken and completed merely as a technical exercise, but which after a few days' reflection is then viewed by its creator as for regarding as a work of art. These things are art only after a certain intentional decision has taken place. Definition makes this plain. Definition 1 makes this plain. The second sort of case is less common, but I think a completely adequate definition of art must be capable of handling it. An example would be the following. A naive or art-unaware creator makes an object Z at T, which he intends for a kind of treatment or regard that is not a correct way of regarding any artworks existing prior to T1. However, it is a kind of treatment or regard that will be correct for certain artworks existing 200 years after T1. I think we want to say that the naive creator's work is art beginning around T2, T1 plus 200, but not before. That is to say, Z becomes art 200 years after its intentioned creation, when the history of art, so to speak, catches up with that Z's creator was engaged in. It would be hard to deny at T2 that Z was art, for after all, it was created and intended for just the sort of treatment that O's, which are recognized artworks at T2, are correctly accorded. Z is art at T2 because it was intended for a kind of regard which, unknown to its creator, turns out to be in the stock of standard regards for artworks at T2. Z at T2 can be seen as projected for a kind of appreciative activity which had become part of artistic tradition. However, before T2, this cannot be seen. There is no plausible ground for considering Z to be art prior to T2. Something cannot be art from the outset just in virtue of its future redemption by the evolution of art. Only actual redemption will turn the trick then and there. Definition 1 handles this case as desired. Z is an artwork at T2 and thereafter, because it is an object of which it is true at T2 that someone rightfully and non-passingly intended it at T1 for regard in a way in which some artworks existing prior to T2 are correctly regarded. However, Z is not, according to 1, an artwork at T1. So what sort of definition of art have we given? In short, a definition that explains what is to be art at a given time in terms of what is art at previous times. To be art at T is to be intentionally related in the required way to something that is art prior to T. The present state of art shows us that certainly nothing more can be required. On the other hand, nothing less than this can be required if we are to locate um, a conception of art which will cover equally Donatello's David and Carl Andre's Lever, Mozart's Jupiter's Symphony and Stockhausen's Momente, Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, and John Berryman's Dream Songs. If there is now an univocal sense of art in which all 6 items count as art, and count as such from the time of their creation, then I believe this sense is given, more or less, by definition 1t. I can almost see readers shake their heads at this point and ask, but does this definition really tell me what art is? Doesn't it seem that I have to know what art is in order to use it? In fact, isn't the definition simply circular, in that it defines art in terms of art? This response is perfectly understandable, but it is nonetheless mistaken. True, there is something reflexive about the definition, in that it exhibits art as essentially referring to itself. But to eliminate this reflexiveness would be to eviscerate the term art of the only universal content it now retains. If artworks at one time are essentially intentionally related to artworks at an earlier time, then on the assumption that definitions attempt to give essences, how could a definition of art fail to explicate artworks, to put it bluntly, in terms of artworks? Thus the appearance of circularity. But strictly speaking, IT is not circular. What it does is define the concept. being art at a given time by reference to the actual body of things that are art prior to that time. True, one cannot tell what counts as art at T without its being granted what things count as art prior to T, but this is in fact just the way art itself works. Furthermore, and this also conforms to the reality of art, to the extent that it is unclear which objects prior to T are artworks, it will be equally unclear which objects at T count as art. True, one cannot use the definition to tell all at once what has, does, and will count as art at all times, but this is because the applicability of art at any stage is always tied to its concrete, historical realization at that stage. That the definition is not circular, if properly understood, can be seen by reflecting that one doesn't have to know what artwork at T means in order for I to tell you. One only has to grant that there is a set of things which are artworks prior to T, whatever they are and whatever that this artwork might mean. The last point suggests another way of expressing the analysis of art that I offer, a way I think that removes any lingering suspicion of circularity. Basically, what I have proposed is that the meaning of art now involves the extension of art previously, that the meaning of art at T is to be given in terms of the extension of art prior to T. Formulating a variant of 1 to make this explicit, we have 1 x is an artwork at T, df x is an object of which it is true at T that some person or persons, having the appropriate proprietary right over x, non-passingly intends or intended x for regard as a work of art, that is to say, regard in any way or ways in which objects in the extension of artwork prior to T are or were correctly or standardly regarded. Note in this definition that when I speak of the extension of the term artwork at a time T, this means the extension of the term at T as it is understood now, that is to say, in its current usage. It is clear that the meaning of artwork is not involved in the right-hand side of this definition, but only its past extension at some point. Thus, I maintain that I1 or I'1 or I1 captures our present concept of art, and without presupposing that concept in doing so. 6. On the view I have presented, which makes art a necessarily backward-looking affair, one may wonder how the revolutionary aspect of art can be accommodated. Surely one might say, if art is continually looking to the rear, how can it change or advance? Won't it always remain the same? To begin to answer this, let me first distinguish revolutionary from merely new or original art. A new artwork is simply one non-identical to any previously existing artwork. An original artwork is a new one significantly different in structural or aesthetic properties from any previously existing artwork. The production of original art could continue indefinitely without there being any additions to the stock of ways in which artworks are regarded. But by a revolutionary artwork, I mean one for which any of the past ways of approaching art seems inadequate, inappropriate, pointless, or impossible. A revolutionary artwork appears to be ultimately calling for a kind of regard which is totally unprecedented. It is plainly only revolutionary art that poses any difficulty for my analysis. Most movements in art are revolutionary in a weak sense, in that they ask for or involve some specific new ways of taking art objects, but few such movements, perhaps none before Dadaism, deny the applicability of all past ways of taking art objects. For example, Impressionist paintings certainly are and were to be approached in specific ways, synoptic vision from a distance, which were not in practice for previous painting, those of the neoclassicists. But there clearly remained ways in common in which they were to be regarded. Thus, weakly revolutionary art does not challenge the historicity of the art-making intention. Art that is revolutionary because it demands or requires a new approach to yield up its fruits to spectators is not per se a problem. A problem only arises for artworks, Dadaist ones, which are intended as revolutionary by their artists, that is to say, intended for treatment in a manner completely distinct from what has gone before. Whether all intentionally revolutionary art is thereby revolutionary simpliciter is a complicated question I will not go into here. Revolutionary art is their Two strategies suggest themselves for reconciling my proposal to this important and characteristic mode of art making. One is to maintain that although consciously revolutionary artists desire that eventually their objects will be dealt with in unprecedented ways, to make them art they must initially direct the audiences to take them, or try taking them, in some way that art has been taken. Otherwise, what can we make of the claim that they have given us art as opposed to something else? The art making intention of consciously revolutionary artists may thus have to be a covertly di- disingenuous one, somewhat along these lines. My object is for regarding in any way artwork have been regarded in the past, but with the expectation that this will prove frustrating or unrewarding, thus prodding the spectator to adopt some other point of view, this being my ultimate intention. The secondary intention embodies the true aim of such art, but the primary intention must be present to make it art at all. A second strategy for dealing with this issue perhaps does less violence to the outward stance of the consciously revolutionary artist. This requires a liberalization of what regard as a work of art amounts to. Instead of construing it as restricted to past correct ways of regarding artworks, broaden it to include completely unheralded types of regards, so long as one is directed to adopt such regards in conscious opposition to those past correct ways. The liberalized version of regard as a work of art then reads as follows: regard in any way or ways in which prior artworks are or were correctly or standardly regarded, or in some other way in contrast to and against the background of those ways. Call this regard as a work of art. Prim. Point. If this second state strategy is adopted, one simply substitutes regard as a work of art prim for regard as a work of art in I prim, IT, and I prime T to get definitions adequate to revolutionary art. Whereas the idea of the first strategy was that self-aware revolutionary artists must, must on one level intend the existing correct art regards, freeing them to intend on another level some entirely new regard, the present strategy does not insist that they should directly intend the existing ways at all, but only that they should project the new way in relation, albeit antagonistic relation, to its predecessors. If they fail to do even that, I think there are no grounds on which one could deny that they fail to make art. Of course, it is open at that point for some other member of the art community, assuming they have the proprietary right to appropriate the would-be artist's work at a later date with the right intention, and so bring it into the sphere of art. The point is, to get a revolutionary mode of activity to be art, it is necessary that its creator, or the creator's subsequent proxy, should consciously nod in the direction of past artistic activity. Which of the two strategies is ultimately preferable as a way of accommodating the historical definition of art to revolutionary art making is a question I will not attempt to settle here. However, for the sake of simplifying succeeding discussion, I will assume for the remainder of this essay the workability of the first strategy and tentatively adopt it. This means that definition I prime T, properly understood, will be viewed as adequate to revolutionary as well as evolutionary art. 7. The view presented so far suggests the following picture of art's evolution. Artworks are objects projected for regard, at least in part, in ways past artworks have been standardly regarded. These artworks, if at all original, will differ from those of the past more or less markedly, and will therefore optimally call for ways of regard which the artist has has usually envisaged, somewhat different from ones already in practice. But then those ways will become part of the tradition of art appreciation, allowing for newer works to be constituted as art by reference to them, and so on. There is thus a deeper continuity in the development of art that is generally noted. Artworks of a given period do more than follow their predecessors. They are even more than causally descended from them, more even than testimonies to the influence of style, medium, and subject matter. Rather, those predecessors are necessarily involved, via the ways in which they have been regarded, in the intentional structure which determines their successors as art. What art becomes depends conceptually, not just causally, on what art has been. Definition I analyzes being art at a given time in terms of what is art prior to that time. The definition can be applied at the present time. Coucou. Ah d'accord, j'arrive. Je suis en direct. Ah, je suis plus en direct.